Thank you very much, Remy, for that lovely introduction. Thank you to my panelists for joining me today. I'm going to get straight into this discussion because it is quite a long one, not in terms of us being very wordy, but because the topic is quite significant and needs a lot of time. What we're really talking about is trying to balance this triangle of trust between the communities, the government, and investors. The reality is that for the longest time, and even now, communities are being managed as a risk thing that needs to be dealt with so we can mine. The reality is that that's not what communities are. So maybe I should just start with you, Peter, because you're sitting closest to me.
Sure, okay, that makes sense.
We all agree that it's a problem.
Yeah.
It's this trust deficit that exists between these three entities is a significant one.
Yeah.
Where do we begin?
Where do we go? I think the first place to begin is why should we enter into a different style of engagement? And I think we need to move away from we're doing this to get our social license to operate and elevate it to how do we ensure that the wealth from mining drives into increasing prosperity for communities and countries. And to do that and to build trust, we need to deepen understanding. So how do we create an environment where we respectfully listen to the communities, to the investors and companies and government in a way, particularly communities, where we don't have a power dynamic? And just like any human relation, we need to listen, understand different points of view, and companies need to act as the catalysts. And the final point there is, we need to come up with a common language. So often, organizations speak in a technocrat language, which is really complex, and communities speak in much more human terms. And it's not because they don't understand things. We just need to find that common language. And then, we co-create a shared vision. And last, companies need to really become a bit more vulnerable. Instead of going there with a plan and saying, what do you think of this plan? They need to just come with no plan and help everyone develop it. And Matthew Kuhn-Kum, who is the Grand Chief of the Cree Nation in Canada, he was on our board, he said, communities and Indigenous people find the word consultation insulting. We want participation, not consultation.
Jackie, if I can then come to you. Communities want participation, they want to be heard, they want the voice. Everybody knows this. Why don't we do it?
It's an interesting question because as Peter is highlighting there, it's how we approach the conversation. And what I hear in a lot of these ESG type discussions, and particularly from the mining industry, is how are we going to get them to our way of thinking? And part of that is a conversation around, well, we need to support them, we'll give them pens at school, rather than enabling them to have the benefits that we all share. And in order to enable, I honestly, and from the core of my being, believe that education is the way to that opportunity. And not educating primary, but educating at the tertiary sector. So a project we run in West Africa, for example, the West African Exploration Initiative, it's been running for 15 years. It's sponsored by 20, 30 mining companies. And the emphasis here is on creating PhDs, postdocs, master's students. And the success story of that is 100 PhDs on geology in the West African region. And what is so beautiful for me is to watch how some of these master students have gone on to do PhDs. They're now running the modules, and they're running their own companies. So when you enable a community that way, you give them the license to be the leaders in their own yards.
Andrew, there isn't a knowledge deficit when it comes to people understanding what could be done, what should be done, etc., when it comes to communities. It's not like we don't know. We're not wandering into the bright blue yonder with no clue about anything. Why is it so difficult for organizations in particular, and sometimes investors themselves, to get this right? What is the trick? Yes, I hear Jackie talking about the language that is being used, but that is fed by something else, that there needs to be a consideration that happens about how important this is, surely.
Yeah, and if we look at our own relationships, we know what a good functioning relationship is. It's communication and it's honesty. That's how you build trust. That's how you build a long-lasting relationship. With the EITI, we promote the open and accountable management of oil, gas, and mineral resources. And part of that, we work with 57 countries, and we have a written standard that requires disclosures by government, by companies, that provides data. And this data can be used by communities, and it's a communication tool, and it's a third-party communication tool to bridge some of those trust gaps, to provide that honesty and transparency. But it's something that communities can look at. They can see what the mining company is paying to the government in terms of taxes. You can see what the government's receiving, and they can also see what's being transferred back to communities in kind of subnational levels. Where mining companies sometimes miss the step is communicating that data. It's not just publishing it for the government or at the national level, it's bringing it down to the level of communities. And oftentimes the mining company is doing the right thing, and sometimes it's the national government that's not providing transfers. Sometimes the mining company isn't advertising the payments social payments they're making. So it's taking the data that's there, reporting it so everyone can see it and it's out in the open, and then finding a way to communicate that with communities so they understand the benefits. They can also understand when things aren't going right, and they can, speak up against that, but bringing them the information and providing them the ability to use it.
To me, sometimes when I look at situations like this, it feels like it's an afterthought, right? Oh, it's something that we need to quickly do.
Yeah.
Find a project, build a school. Oh, they need pen. It's that kind of thinking. Whereas, by Andrew's suggestion, if we're thinking about this as a relationship, it's something that evolves and happens over a period of time. At which point do we begin taking it seriously in that nature and start doing things and developing those relationships over time? Why can't we do that?
Well, I think sorry, is that a bit loud?
Yeah, no, you're good.
It's okay. You're absolutely right that timing is everything, and a late problem solved is a problem of trust that is added on to the original nature of the problem. So I think that the other aspect of that is that we often end up solving for the wrong problems when we go in with a set, and I think this is part of what Peter was saying, is that we go in with a set of assumptions. You need this, this is how you're going to be really impressed with me as a company, so I'm going to offer all these things, instead of starting at a baseline to say, well, what is it that is needed in this relationship that is of greatest value, and what is it that is of such value that it's non-negotiable. Getting that stuff out early is a way of avoiding it. Now, to your point about evolving, like all relationships have to evolve. So the structure, I do believe in formal relationships, formalized relationships. You can't have trust without commitment. You can't have trust without accountability. So I do believe that, a handshake is a nice way to start, but where I've seen it succeed, the diamond mines and others in northern Canada, there's very much a formalized structure. That's a good thing, but it has to evolve over time. It has to be responsive to triggers and thresholds of concern or thresholds of opportunity. So the three things. One is start early and co-define what you need so that you're not already breaking trust by making assumptions. Then you start to build something that is more formalized, a set of mutual commitments that are accountable, and then build into that triggers that allow you to revise and adapt according to one party or the other's needs. And that way you got resilience, but you still have structure that allows you to, relax into something. It's kind of like getting married instead of dating. You've got something that's there, there's something real, and then you can start working out from there, but always be prepared to be responsive.
Jackie, you touched on this a moment ago, and I think extending on what Alan's just said, communities often feel spoken at.
Yes.
Right? Not spoken with or asked. Right? It's the respect thing, it's the engagement thing. How often are we seeing organizations genuinely saying, wait a minute, before we're doing anything, let's go talk to these people and just get a sense of what's
And do
going,
you
right?
want-
And to what extent, when that doesn't happen, which we can see often doesn't happen, is there an ability from the community side who may feel disempowered to begin insisting that actually, if we're not engaging in this nature, you're not coming here?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because there's an empowerment question for me here, I suppose.
And one of the things that concerns me about this new revolution and the green revolution and the resources that are in Africa in particular is colonization 2.0. And that colonization about being told what is going to happen to Africa and not listening to the voice of Africa, in particular that emerging youth. And you see it in that 30, 40-year age group where they're starting to talk about a pan-African agenda rather than a national agenda, but how do we bring benefit to our community? And one of the very special things about Africa, and you'd be well in tune with this, is the concept of Ubuntu. That concept of doing good for the greater good. And that is implicit in the culture. So when you have companies and mining companies coming in and being very transactional, what they're disrespecting is that Ubuntu culture.
I saw you not.
Yes, I got it. I got it.
Peter's like, please, let me speak.
I put my
yes,
hand up.
Peter, you can speak.
Yeah, my daughters put their hands up and say, we're not at school, we don't need to, but yeah, I'll speak. So we have this concept of regional catalyst where we bring together all the different stakeholder and owner groups. An example was in Zambia recently. We brought together, and this was instigated by the Zambian government, was, how do we more effectively use the money or the value we're getting from mining in an effective way? So communities, NGOs, mining companies all together, and what came out of those sessions is, respectful listening. We co-created a social investment framework. And this is focused on the northern part of Zambia, and so phase 2 is now we're piloting 2 or 3 of the ideas that have nothing to do with mining, actually. It's about empowering the communities to build other economic value engines for them and see if that, test drive the investment framework. And the view for the government is to eventually adopt that as the way of operating in Zambia. The key is everybody had a voice in it. It wasn't the mining companies or the government saying this is what we're going to do. And I think that's just good for everyone. And the last point here is, Indigenous people like sitting, and communities like sitting down and talking. It's not something we do very well, to be honest, in the West. So, and everything's verbal, nothing's written. And I think these are things we have to respect. Because often they say things and we go, oh, well, where's it written down? And they go, no, we hand everything down verbally through generations. So we need to kind of understand and respect that is how they operate. And that's the point. So we're doing a partnership with the First Nations Major Projects Coalition. They analysed 100 ESG standards and found Indigenous people were mentioned twice, and only 2 of them. One was in an appendix, and both was as managing risk. And if you don't have a lawsuit with Indigenous people, things are good. Wow. And they read that and just go, we have a long way to go on this journey.
That sounds quite extraordinary.
Yeah, anyway.
but I think the bottom line, and what that emphasizes for me, is that we do the bare minimum. What is the least that we need to do to make this? How many boxes can we get away with not ticking? And how do we justify the fact that we didn't tick those boxes? Oftentimes. You're frowning, Jackie.
No, I'm thinking one of... I don't like to think of, building trust by checking off boxes. No. I think there needs to be, trust is like a crystal vase.
Yeah.
You break it once, and that's it. So how do you mend the pain that we've already inflicted as an industry and is in the societal memory? We're not starting at zero.
No.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about that. How do we mend? When we spoke previously, one of the things that you said, Jackie, was looking at how it's not just about the engagement, but ensuring that the communities have a genuine and real stake in what is happening, not just in terms of ownership, but in terms of skills, in terms of work, in terms of this is part of what we do, and you're not just coming and landing on our heads, essentially.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit more about what that looks like in reality and how one better makes that happen? And then I'd like to hear a similar view from you, Andrew, please.
Well, one of the things over the last few days I've been absolutely blown away by is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia's approach to engagement. And we had this at the Ministerial Roundtable, we're having it in the sessions. For me, there are two ways to approach a relationship, that you're trying to build a relationship. One is through cooperation. So you enter that relationship to get something for yourself, and you hope you win out of the deal. The other is proper collaboration. The real root definition of collaboration is to go into that relationship to build a benefit, but to also create benefit for others. And that's what we're witnessing over the last 2 days. It's the first time I've ever seen that in the mining industry, that true collaboration. We are here. What I hear the Saudi Arabian government say is we are here, we're open to learning, we're comfortable and confident in our position in this, and we want you to learn from the journey and get benefit as well. And I think that is absolutely remarkable and should be what you call it?
Congratulations.
Applauded. Applauded. Andrew?
In running with this relationship analogy and getting back to one of your earlier points, if you're going to get engaged or married, you better lay some groundwork ahead of time.
I just want everybody to understand that this isn't a panel about how you do
this
your
is not marriage
relationships,
therapy.
This is about communities.
but if you don't do that, you better show up with a big rock or be very good looking, I suppose. But what we need to do is lay the groundwork before the mine heads to the community, and that's engaging civil society, industry, and government in a multi-stakeholder group to debate issues on the sector. So they are involved in governance from the get-go. So it's not just all of a sudden when a mine appears in one area of the country, but they've been involved in governance since day one. And they've been able to provide their input, and that's building trust there. And then you can take that out into the regions where people have already hopefully had a say and been engaged in how that sector is governed. And so that's laying the groundwork ahead of time. And I think that it will help solve a lot of the issues ahead of time in making sure that there's a voice prior to mine development.
To what extent are we really hearing conversations around, okay, we need to do ABC, but the reality of if we don't do this and do it properly, what does it mean for us as an organization? Can you talk a little bit about that, Alan?
Yeah, I think one of the aha moments for me was in part reading the work of Daniel Franks and others on the cost of community conflict. And I was given the report by a company which will go unnamed, but I was asking them, why are you involved in the standards process? Why are you getting ahead? Why are you investing in these ways? And he said, well, yes, of course, we'd love to do this stuff and like to have good reputation, and it's good for our ability to retain and attract staff, but ultimately, the cost of doing it wrong often doesn't show up on the books, but the research suggests that there's in the order of, I think it was $10 million a week of net present value loss for the cost of community conflict. This was a survey done globally on major projects, $3 to $5 billion, and it was documenting the best they could. Like, I'm okay with self-interest. I mean, these are not moral institutions. They are amoral capitalist organizations that are paid to do this. You can't do your job as a mining company without accounting for the kinds of real costs that are often hidden off the books that come along with a lack of trust. So I think you can make a very easy business case. This isn't about philanthropy. This isn't about altruism. This is about just good bloody business sense, and the evidence for it is overwhelming. So, I think we just need to get on to say this, when they tell the cost of doing business, literally, this is the cost of doing business. And the return on investment in trust is many folds.
I can see Jackie's itching.
Yeah.
Hang on a second for me. Peter's itching
I'm sorry,
too.
Jackie. You wait. No,
Peter's got the
who's waiting?
fingers on the itches. You go, Peter.
Yeah, I'll
And
go.
then
No,
Jackie.
Jackie.
Jackie, just hang on one second.
You have to wait, Jackie.
One of the
Jackie,
Peter.
wait. Peter first.
oh sorry, Peter.
Peter.
See, there was a fine.
I can tell you guys need to be managed. I need to separate you,
You need
all.
to separate.
Behave. Okay, Peter.
So,
A lack of
Makudu
passion
Fani
on this
is the
subject is
chief
really
exec.
troubling.
Oh, Dale, it's brilliant to watch, right? Yeah, marriage counselling the other day. So Makudu Fani, who was one of kind of the more progressive leaders in the mining industry, and just stepped down from Anglo American, where some of that data came from, was, he was always, there's the cliche which says it's no longer this or thing. Sustainability and making money is not an or, it's an and. And I think it applies to what we're talking about. And the cost of getting this wrong can be monumental through development and operational phase. I think, though, the mining companies, it's about capabilities, but they also enter the room with the wrong mindset. Miners enter the room from day one, we're in a negotiation. Communities and governments are like that. The communities are coming in with an open book. And an example was an Aboriginal woman leader that I spoke to at IMARC. She said, I want mining companies, when they come in a meeting for me, and this is in Queensland, to acknowledge that the ground that they're on and they want to develop is my country. And she said, I can't get them to acknowledge it. And all I want it for is a mark of respect. And I said, well, the problem is they probably think you're taking a negotiating position. And if they admit that, they've weakened their negotiating position. So I think it's a combination of capability, mindset, and respect. And this is really, really difficult. And I think standards don't solve what we're talking about. They come later. And I think mining companies are using standards, to be honest, as a fig leaf. They don't work. I mean, that's gobbledygook at this stage. They're important to then track what you agree, but you can't use standards to do what we're talking about. That's like coming into, one thing, a human relationship. You go, actually, before we go out, let me just get my standard out of this, and we just need to, you just wouldn't do that in a human relationship. Why would you do it in this partnership?
Okay, Jackie.
Anyway, Jackie.
Yeah, I know. She's suffering over there.
And I hear, these are all good things. They're all important things. But you started the conversation with the topic of trust deficit. We're not starting at zero. We're starting at minus
Negative.
1,000.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you read the book by Tom Burgess, who's a journalist, his book, The Looting Machine, where he documented what was happening on the ground in Africa with the resource extraction, and that's petroleum and the minerals. And when you read that book and you understand how the community is experiencing mining, it's not starting at zero. We're not going in there now and saying, right, let's start the relationship. We're going in there having pilfered, having pumped things into the water, having damaged with, artisanal mining, enabled the mercury that goes in. So we're not starting at zero.
We have a trust
We
deficit.
have to sort out the trust deficit before we actually move forward. And I think this, again, coming back to Saudi Arabia's unique position, is they haven't been part of that history.
Yeah.
So they offer us an avenue to work with that trust deficit.
There's an interesting example, if I can, because it's absolutely true. And it also, one other little side point is that what happens to one company happens to all
Yes.
companies,
Exactly.
Yeah.
which is why I think
our
it's really
There's no,
important to
mining
bring-
is the brand.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
a brand, and so you can't say, well, I'm not like those guys.
Yeah.
It just doesn't work.
It's
But
us.
that's a side point. But there was an interesting example when the Voisey's Bay, second largest nickel deposit in the world came up. The Inuit were not predisposed to take what was offered to them. One of the problems they had was their land claim had not been settled, and it was all often delayed. So what they said to the company is, well, how about we start with you supporting our land claim to the federal government? Once you have expressed that level of commitment to our interests and we have established a basis on which we can begin discussions, then we will start our discussions. But my point is that I think companies have to understand that they're bearing not only the industry legacy, but the government legacy. And this triangle of trust is about how you relate with the community to the government, with the community to investors, with the community to your fellow mining industry folks. And if industry bands together in the wrong way, then they undercut that potential to deal with the legacy issues. So it's a complex thing, and sometimes it will require, which is a really tricky thing for mining companies, working with the community to represent those interests to the government with a very different kind of leverage.
Okay, Alan, seeing as you're on that point, I'm going to start with you. We're going to go quickly. 2 points, things that need to happen fairly quickly. Low-hanging fruit, for lack of a better phrase. That need to happen to begin to realistically and correctly address this lack of balance in this trust. So, 1 and 2.
Sure. I think we need to start with an emphasis on the G part of ESG. I think it's the least well understood, and it's the one that people are often most scary about. So if you're thinking about what you're doing, you need to think about how are we going to discuss governance? How are we going to share risk? How are we going to share benefit? That's a scary thing, but it's the only way forward. So I would say start with a mindset that says governance is on the table, and we have to be prepared to share decision making and share how we go forward. The second thing I think is more of an activated learning network where people who have had success are being able to share with others who don't. So there's a direct ability for communities to learn from each other about the kinds of mechanisms, the kinds of processes and others, because I'm a big believer that those kinds of exchange can accelerate progress really quickly. Yeah.
Andrew?
I would say multi-stakeholder dialogue. In most jurisdictions, minerals are for the benefit of the people, so let's get the people involved early in governance of the sector, along with companies and government. And then I would challenge companies to be transparent. Be transparent at the licensing phase. Who owns your company? Beneficial ownership. Disclose that information. The public should know whether there's a politically exposed person or others, and that will help root out some corruption in the licensing systems. Provide the public with your contract transparency. Lay it all out there. It creates for longer term deals when everyone understands the terms of the deal. The public believes that they're getting a good deal for their resources, and that creates a long-lasting contract and builds trust.
Jackie?
I'm going to be a little bit contentious, if I may.
Uh-oh.
I think before we do any of this, we need courageous leadership. And that courageous leadership needs to do 2 things. And the first is to acknowledge, respectfully acknowledge the history and the pain that has been felt. And the second then is to work from that point of shared acknowledgement to co-create that future.
Great. Peter?
I think 2 things actually building off everyone. One is the leaders need to make what we're talking about as important as safety in their companies, and they need to do it now. It's everyone's job. It's important. We have 0 tolerance for anything going wrong, just like safety. And 2, courageous leaders, go and make yourself vulnerable and go and try and have these sessions where you have no agenda, and it could be a reconciliation session like we've been involved with in South Africa. And just sit down and listen. It doesn't have to be a new project. It could be an existing project, and you'll be amazed at what happens. The value is far greater than any downside that you may see.
And on that note, that was really fun. I enjoyed that. That was awesome. Thank you so very much. A round of applause for my panel, please. Thank you.
You did great.